Final Fantasy III is the first game in the series that I truly love. I was pretty critical in my retrospectives for the first two games, and while I'm still going to do my best to point out the downfalls of this game, my bias might start to show a bit. Obviously, this is just going to be my opinion, and you're all entitled to your own, but between the much more polished UI, greatly smoothed out pacing, and decision-making feeling much more impactful in this game, I felt it was a vast improvement over the first two. And this is actually the first game in the series that I played right around when it came out. Okay, not the NES version, I'm still not Japanese, and I was still born in 1993, but its first, and for a long time, only English release was on the DS back in 2006. I don't know why it took 16 years either. And on the subject of the DS version, this game has had the most significant differences between the various versions, with the 2D and 3D versions being almost different games entirely. At their core, the two versions are essentially the same game, the story is mostly the same, the focus on job changing to take advantage of enemy weaknesses is still there, but in the 3D version, the jobs have been expanded upon, many of the characters are expanded upon, and the game has received a significant balance overhaul. For this video, I decided to play both the 3D version and the NES version with a translation patch. I didn't play the Pixel remaster, but from my understanding, it's largely based on the NES version, with the big change being the removal of capacity for changing jobs. And unlike FF2, I actually did finish both versions of the game that I started this time. As per usual, let's start off with the story. Now, there's a pattern with the early Final Fantasies up until the end of the Super Nintendo era where the even-numbered titles have a much stronger focus on the story and storytelling, and the odd-numbered titles have a stronger focus on the gameplay. Now, the 3D version of this game did significantly increase the emphasis on characters and storytelling, but this game is still first and foremost a gameplay-centric game. I don't mean this in a derogatory way, I think that it still has a decent story and touches on some very interesting topics, but if you compare it to FF2, for example, you can clearly see the difference in focus. The game starts off with Xande creating an earthquake, revealing the Altar Cave and the Wind Crystal. The four Warriors of Light explore the cave and are granted some of its power, and receive instructions to go and hunt down the remaining 3 crystals to obtain the power to save the world. They rescue Desh from Bahamut, quell the Sea Dragon, stop the Tower of Owen from collapsing and bringing down the floating continent, obtain the power of the Water Crystal from the Isle of Dwarves, defeat King Hein, obtain an airship to finally leave the floating continent, and holy shit, the world is huge. The floating continent was actually a fragment of the surface world that was ripped out when Xande plunged the world into darkness, or froze time in the 3D version, and the surface world has the remaining 2 crystals of water and earth. We obtain the blessing of the Water Crystal, restoring light and time to the surface world, find a fake Earth Crystal, have some adventures in Sardonia, and then we meet Doga and Une. The two of them, alongside Xande, used to be students of the Magus Noah who had bestowed gifts upon each of them. Doga received vast knowledge of magics, Une complete control over the dream world, and Xande the gift of mortality, which drove him mad and caused him to turn to darkness to destroy the world. Doga prepares a key to Eureka where ultimate power can be obtained, and Une guides us to find an airship that can hop over mountains and then towards the Cave of Shadows where the final Fang is located to give us access to the ancient maze in Crystal or Silk's tower. But in order to obtain the keys to unlock Eureka in the Crystal Tower, Doga and Une will have to sacrifice themselves in order to produce the necessary energy. The Warriors of Light then finally obtain the blessing of the Earth Crystal in the Ancient's Maze, power from the Forbidden Land Eureka, and climb the Crystal Tower to face Xande. He paralyzes them with the Curse of the 5 Worms, but the spirits of Doga and Une call upon the allies we'd made along our journey, and Princess Sarah, Cid, Desh, an old man, and King Alice help break us free and allow us to push forward and fight Xande. But we're not done yet. Xande was only drawing his power from the darkness, and the threat of darkness is still looming out there. We dive into the world of darkness and are instantly obliterated by the cloud of darkness. Oh. We free the 4 Warriors of Darkness and use the powers of the Dark Crystals to weaken the cloud of darkness enough so that we can defeat her now and save the world. And that's the basic story summary for Final Fantasy III. Again, it's largely the same between both versions, but the 3D version adds some extra characterization to just about every named character, and even gives the 4 Warriors of Light names and personalities. Looking at the Warriors of Light in particular, in the 2D games they're still leagues ahead of Final Fantasy I's main cast, as they still have dialogue and interactions with the rest of the characters, but they're really brought to life in the 3D version. In the 2D version, you start out with the full roster of characters and that's that, but in the 3D version you're introduced to each of them individually and learn a bit about their personalities and backstories before meeting the next one. Luneth is the protagonist. Ark is Luneth's friend in and is a bit of an outcast, getting picked on by the other kids in the town. Refia is the daughter of the blacksmith in Kazus and is a bit rebellious. Ingus is a knight of Castle Sasune, fiercely loyal to protecting Princess Sarah. You still meet all of them fairly quickly within the first hour of gameplay, but spreading them out a bit allows for a bit more of a personal connection to be made with each character. And each of the supporting characters that tag along for a bit forms a bond with one character in particular, further fleshing out each of them. Refia disapproves of Desh's debauchery and wants him to remain more loyal to Selena and Kanan. Ingus and Sarah have romantic implications. Ark and Prince Aelys are both more socially awkward and lacking in confidence and bond over that. Luneth and Arya bond over using the crystals to save the world. Again, nothing super major, and Luneth in particular felt like he got a lot less characterization than the other 3, but it was still a nice addition to have to connect better with the characters that we're going to be spending 20 to 30 hours with. While the first game technically introduced the job system to the franchise, it didn't really get fleshed out at all until this game. In Final Fantasy I, you chose your jobs at the start of the game, and that was that. You had a job advancement towards the middle of the game, but you were still locked into that decision you made right at the beginning, and the jobs lacked a lot of what would later make them feel unique, only having the basic commands of attack, magic, run, and item, and no unique passives apart from weapon and spell availability. But in Final Fantasy III, the scope of the job system is significantly increased and is one of the major selling points of the game. It's still not as involved as something like 5 or Tactics, but it's still a vast improvement over what we had before. The first major change made in this game is the ability to change jobs whenever you want, and the game even encourages you to do so. You don't have access to every job right at the beginning, and different dungeons and bosses are made significantly easier by swapping around to the jobs with the right tools to handle them. Now, only the Pixel Remaster allows you to change jobs completely free of charge. The NES version had a capacity cost, which you earned a bit of after every fight, and the 3D version had a job adjustment phase where your stats were lowered for a few fights after changing jobs to prevent constant switching. There is a somewhat esoteric system for determining what the capacity cost is or how long the job adjustment phase is, but it's never really explained and honestly isn't such a big deal. You can always just do a few extra random encounters if you need to. And the second major change is the addition of unique commands. More so in the 3D version, but still applicable to both versions. Rather than everyone having the same basic commands, for example, Geomancers have Terrain, which uses a random ability based on the area you're in. Masters, or Black Belts in the 3D version, have a Build Up or Boost, which gives bonus damage on your next attack. Dragoon has Jump, which kind of functions like Fly in Pokemon. Not an exhaustive list, but just a few examples. The NES version didn't quite give a full unique identity to every single job, but it certainly made some attempts. There are still 5 jobs that have no unique ability whatsoever, and an additional 10 that all have magic as their command. Obviously, weapon and spell availability and spell slot distribution are still going to be different, but for example, Warrior and Ranger still have magic as their command instead of something a bit more identifiable. Also, every class is capped to 4 commands in the NES version, with attack and item being almost universal among the jobs, meaning that the jobs with magic or a unique command will only ever get access to one of either defend or flee. The lack of flee on some classes isn't necessarily the biggest deal, since a healer is pretty much mandatory for most parts of the game, and White Mage, Devout, and Sage all have access to flee. And if you really wanted to skip encounters, Thieves have a 100% flee skill, but the distribution of defend is the slightly more awkward part to me. Spell slots are valuable, especially in the NES version, and so if I don't have to use one to heal up, then I should really be conserving them. But then these healing classes really don't have anything to do with their turn. As a healer or a caster of any sorts, using attack felt like a waste of a turn, but it was really the only action that didn't waste resources that it could have taken in many situations. The 3D version removing this 4 action limit and giving defend and flee as default commands was a welcome change that made a lot of turns just feel less bad. And the 3D version further remedied some of the homogeneity of the jobs by giving warrior, monk, Viking, and ninja proper unique abilities, as well as changing the action for a couple of classes from magic to a more thematic one, like rangers getting barrage. Knights and scholars do technically gain the magic command, but they do still keep their class identity with other abilities and passives. And what all of this does is it allows you to have a fairly customizable experience with your journey. If you like big beefcakes, then load up on knights, warriors, monks, etc. Or if you prefer a more magical class fantasy, then you have black, white, red mages, geomancers, summoners, whatever. Whatever you want. There's 22 to 23 jobs in the game depending on the version, so feel free to mix and match to your heart's content. At least until you run into one of the job check sections. There are a handful of sections in this game, the NES version especially, where the game very heavily encourages you to not only use specific classes, but sometimes even stack them. I don't hate the idea of the game encouraging you to engage with the job system in order to have an easier time, but it's a little bit heavy-handed in its execution. A little ways into the game, there's a dungeon that forces everyone to be in the mini status, which essentially invalidates any physical job since physical attacks will always deal 1 damage while mini. Hein has high physical defense and changes his elemental weakness every few turns, so you're at a severe disadvantage without a scholar to identify his weakness. Garuda constantly spams high damage lightning and is weak to spears, so dragoons with jump will significantly outdamage everything else as well as dodge a bunch of his attacks. The Cave of Shadows is filled with enemies that split, basically forcing you to use Dark Knights with Dark Blade so that you're not constantly triggering split. The 3D remake is significantly rebalanced in a number of ways to cut down on the amount of times where you're forced to stack jobs, though. And it's only really the mini dungeons where you're still super heavily restricted in terms of jobs. Hein's weakness can be discovered with Libra in this version, and you have access to Geomancers at this point, which are able to deal damage regardless. While Garuda attacks twice now, he also adds in physical attacks instead of just spamming lightning, making his onslaught a lot easier to heal through. But the splitting enemies are the biggest difference in the two versions of the game. In the NES version, there can be up to 6 enemies in battle at once, while presumably due to the DS hardware limitations, the 3D version caps it at 3. This keeps encounters from spiraling out of control, particularly in the ancient ruins before you get access to Dark Blades to stop the splitting. Now, admittedly I did have poor job choices for the ancient ruins. I, for some reason, forgot that I had access to Geomancers, which would have made life a hell of a lot easier. And to the game's credit, outside of the ancient ruins, unless I missed something, it does properly communicate its job demands to you. The people of Tokal will mention Hein's changing weakness, and someone will even specifically mention Scholar to you after the Fire Crystal. The Cave of Shadows has Dark Knights near the entrance warning you about the splitting of the enemies, and there are Dark Blades scattered throughout the cave. And in Sardonia, the game just shoves Dragoon gear down your throat, and Garuda's weakness might be the worst kept secret that I have ever heard of.
Won't someone bring us a Dragoon?
Thankfully, for the most part, you are free to change jobs to your heart's content, so it's not particularly challenging to get a proper party lineup. But there is one small thing to keep in mind, which is your jobs when you're leveling up. There's only one stat in the game that cares about what your job is when you level up, but it's a really important one: your HP. HP gains are dependent on the job's vitality stats, so ideally you want your level ups to be on classes like Viking or Master/Black Belt. In my NES playthrough, I had 2 characters on Master for most of the game to make sure I had sufficient HP to survive the endgame. Can you guess which ones? Unlike my experience with the first 2 games, I can actually say that this game is difficult at times. Your damage doesn't ever massively outscale the enemies without significant grinding at any point, and incoming damage is always appropriate, or possibly even too high for your HP values, forcing you to keep a really close eye on it. And while I can say both versions are difficult, they're difficult in different ways. The NES version is much more of a resource management game, and for the most part the random encounters are where the difficulty lies. Multi-target options are weaker, a higher enemy limit, and what felt to me like a higher encounter rate were all major contributing factors, whereas the 3D version had the majority of its difficulty lie in the boss fights. The biggest difference is most bosses now have 2 attacks per turn, or 3 in Cerberus's case, meaning that an unlucky turn is significantly more punishing. The boss could just seemingly have a vendetta against a certain character, or have more chances to target a freshly revived character. Both of these are valid difficulty points, and it's mainly going to come down to your personal preference. In general, though, I found the NES version to be quite a bit easier outside of a few points. Bosses were almost exclusively easier across the board, except for a couple rare cases like Garuda or Ahriman, but up until the Ancient Ruins, the random encounters weren't significantly harder to the point of making up for the easier boss fights. In the Ancient Ruins, though, a bad ambush with enemies deciding to split on turn 1 was the worst thing to see, and for some reason I forgot I had access to Geomancer here. You don't have access to Dark Blades yet, so you have to rely on statusing the enemy so that they don't split upon being hit by a physical attack, but the Ancient Sword can be unreliable in its paralysis applications, so sometimes fights are just going to be awful. This fight, for example, lasted about 15 minutes and was far more miserable than any boss fight in either version. And if we're talking about difficulty in Final Fantasy III, then we have to talk about the final dungeon, which is actually 2 dungeons. But most people are probably also going to do Eureka, so it's actually 3 dungeons. Actually, you have to park the airship outside of the Ancient's Maze, so it's actually 4 dungeons. FF3's endgame is really damn long, it turns out. You can save between the Ancient's Maze and the Crystal Tower, and you can back out to the world map after Eureka to save, so you only really have to do 2 dungeons in a row, but if you want to make some changes or buy some items or weapons or armor, you'd still have to back all the way out of Ancient's Maze to do so. The game's dungeons can already be fairly long, and especially so when 4 of them are all stapled together. And in addition to its length, the final bosses just ramp up the difficulty by quite a bit as well. The NES version is a little bit infamous for Meteo memes from either Zonde, Zonde's clone, Echidna, or Ahriman, and the final boss has exactly 1 attack, which is a high damage AoE every single turn. And then in the 3D version, again, the bosses have multiple turns when they're this dangerous, so it just gives plenty of opportunities for random memes to happen. The game for the most part isn't too grindy. Maybe at a couple points you might feel underpowered compared to a boss and grind up a level or 2, or swap jobs and grind out a few job levels to have an easier time, but if you're not fleeing from every encounter, then you should be capable of handling more or less every boss in the game up until the final dungeon. But to simply have enough HP to literally survive the attacks in the final dungeon, you need to have either some amazing planning throughout the game and probably a bit of luck, or you need to do a solid amount of grinding. If you perfectly planned out your level ups to be on high vitality classes the whole game, then you could either minimize or maybe even completely remove the grind to get through the final dungeon, but that's not something anyone doing a first playthrough is going to have done, so you'll probably have to do a fair amount of grinding right when you get here just to have a chance at surviving. One thing that this game made pretty heavy use of was secret passages. Technically, they originated in FF2, but they were a much smaller part of the dungeon design and used very infrequently. Most of FF3's dungeons, and hell, even a lot of the towns had secret passages leading to hidden loot or sometimes mandatory progression. This left a lot of rewards on the table for you if you really wanted to explore every nook and cranny. For the most part, they were well telegraphed, with either the walls looking different or a button opening a wall into a completely blank void that pretty obviously became a path. Some of the buttons or objects to interact with to open up this second kind could be a bit awkward though. The 3DS version had a zoom feature where interactable objects would sparkle, but it was a bit clunky to be constantly checking. Now, this mechanic didn't really survive much into the 3D era of the series. I can't remember if any of the games past 6 kept them, honestly, but maybe there's something I'm forgetting about. As the graphical style has turned more and more realistic, hidden passages in this manner just didn't make quite as much sense to implement. But I've played 5 in particular quite a number of times, and that one definitely has hidden passages everywhere, so seeing where they really started to come to fruition as a mechanic was kinda neat. One of the coolest parts about this game, in my opinion, is the gradual expansion of the world map especially in the 3D version where you have the minimap available right from the start and can watch it happen in real time. I don't know how to put it into words, but maps are just cool. I'm sure many of you probably remember as a kid getting a new fantasy book and just staring at the map in the first few pages on your way home and just imagining the journey that you were about to go on. FF3's map starts out tiny with just Kazus, Castle Sasune, and Sealed Cave, but every major story beat slowly reveals more and more of the world map until you can see the whole floating continent. But we're still not done yet. You'll eventually get another airship and are told to leave the floating continent, and... Okay, currently it's just all ocean, but once you complete one dungeon real quick, then you have a huge new world map, which is expanded again a tiny bit when you can go underwater. The surface world isn't exactly jam-packed with stuff, doing its best to impersonate Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which is a little bit annoying, particularly in the NES version since you need to cast a spell or use... Man, fan translations used to be wild, huh? To see the world map, as there aren't a ton of good landmarks for finding a few locations like the floating continent. But it's still an incredibly powerful gameplay moment. You've explored pretty much everywhere you can see on the floating continent, and maybe you think you're kind of close to completing the game, and then suddenly you realize just how much of this world is left to explore. As I mentioned earlier, Final Fantasy III does suffer from that early odd-numbered Final Fantasy pattern of having a weaker focus on the story, but I have noticed that a couple future entries revisit some similar themes and almost feel like Square giving this story another chance. Final Fantasy IX in particular is where I really noticed this. Kuja parallels Zonde in that when faced with his own mortality, he loses his mind and refuses to allow the world to continue on without him. And then Necron comes out of absolutely fucking nowhere at the end, much like Cloud of Darkness did. Ultimecia from Final Fantasy VIII also has some slight similarities, albeit not quite as strong. Both her and Zonde are powerful magic users who plunge their world into stasis to overcome the debilitating circumstances they were put in. Zonde to avoid his own newfound mortality, and Ultimecia to avoid persecution for being a sorceress. Now, these games definitely still have their own share of storytelling issues, which we'll get into when I get further into this series, but it does feel like Square wanted to give aspects of this story another go once they'd refined their methods of telling a story through video games. I didn't really talk much about the UI of the previous two games, as I just didn't really think to do so, but when I played the NES version of this game, it really jumped out at me. Minor stylistic choices aside, the battle and menu UIs are very much what I picture when I think of a Final Fantasy game, and it's at least a little bit surprising that this design was more or less finalized so early on in the series, especially when you compare the menu to even just one game earlier. And once again, music. It's good. I wasn't too big on Final Fantasy II's music, as I felt the game was far too long for how short and unvaried the soundtrack was. And while Final Fantasy III is a little bit longer than FF2, the soundtrack is over twice as long, meaning that each song doesn't get quite as stale over the course of your playthrough. And obviously this is just my own personal opinion, but I think I just enjoy the songs in this game more than the previous two. The regular boss theme is great. Crystal Tower, Eureka, and World of Darkness all have excellent dungeon themes. Overall, I prefer the soundtrack for the 3D version the most, followed by the NES version and then the Pixel Remaster version. But that being said, I do not care which version I'm listening to when Cloud of Darkness' theme comes on. I don't know what came over him, but Nobuo locked in harder than any human being on the planet had thus far when he wrote her battle theme. It could be the NES, 3D, Pixel Remaster, Final Fantasy XIV, Dissidia, Black Mages, hell, even Chocobo Racing version for all I care. This song is, in my opinion, the first true banger in the franchise. Obviously, I've been a lot more positive on FF3 than I was on the first two games, and there's a good reason for that. I genuinely loved this game and really enjoyed my time with it. Which is a bit weird looking back on it, as I distinctly remember only thinking it was alright back when I played it on the DS as a teenager, but I can't deny that replaying it recently was one of the more enjoyable video gaming experiences that I've had lately. There's definitely some amount of nostalgia talking, but as much as people like to try and claim otherwise, objective opinions don't really exist, so the only takeaway I can have is that I apparently really enjoyed this game. I did enjoy the 3D version more than the 2D version. The extra characterization that everyone got, especially the playable characters, really helped to make me feel like I was on a journey with real people and not just playing a video game. Small things like Refia refusing to return to Kazus because she couldn't bear to see her father in his cursed state, or the small cutscenes in the Tower of Owen with your party leader looking a bit concerned really added to my immersion. But that being said, I could easily recommend either version of the game, and I had a blast with both of them. Or at the very least, the Pixel remaster over the NES version if you really have a strong aversion to older games that lack modern quality of life features. Either way, definitely my favorite game so far in this retrospective list. It won't stay that way for too long. One of my top 3 games in the whole franchise is coming up very soon, but I still thoroughly enjoyed this one.